We are calling this teaching a rich man and a beggar. We're putting down that it is a notable contrast, and that very much understates the obvious as we will be getting going. What I want you to see is this has actually been a progression of something that started back in Luke 15, verse 1, because as we go through this last parable in what we call Luke chapter 16, we're going to look at where we started in Luke 15, and you can see a progression of a message that is continuing, that needs to be continued, because either it's not being received or it's not being understood. And you're also going to see in this last parable very much a finality of the message. You'll see more of that as we get in later into this parable. That being said, let's move forward. The verses we're going to cover today are verses 19 to 21. There was a certain rich man, which was clothed in purple and fine linen, and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar, named Lazarus, which was laid at his gate full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. As we talked about in the previous teaching, there are a number of, and I believe the word there was used was hooks. We can use the word links to chapter 15, and of course there are, because it's a continuation of what was started in Luke 15. So there would be tie-ins to go back and forth above and beyond what I cover in this series, because I didn't cover them all on purpose. I left a little for you on your own, in your own searching, in your own studies. You do yourself well to go back and look at those and see what the Lord will show you. We've got some things to keep in mind. In Jeremiah 9:23 to 9:24, there is a lesson that we should learn. Now keep in mind that at the time this parable was told, the New Testament was not written yet. So this is something that they would have had. This is an underlying thought being taught within the parable. And we're putting this at the beginning. And for those of you who are astute, you would write down, if nothing else, you would write down the chapter and the verses so you could go back and look at them later, or maybe have your Bible open as a reference point. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, neither let the mighty man glory in his might. Let not the rich man glory in his riches." We see a number of cases in the Gospel of Luke where we could apply this. We could apply this to the rich young ruler. We could apply this to this parable. We could attach it to a number of parables within the Gospel of Luke. It says, "But let him that glorieth glory in this, that he understands and knows me." See, because that's the important thing, because anything you have in this world is a means. Remember in one of the other previous teachings we talked about earthly silver being used to purchase heavenly gold? We use it in a metaphorical sense to really strike the thing home that what you have here, because when you compare the values, even in today's market, of silver and gold, there's a huge discrepancy between the two, but yet they're both considered extremely valuable, aren't they? Right. But given the choice, if I put 5 pounds of silver in one hand and I put 5 pounds of gold in the other, and I said you can have whichever one you want, you're not going to grab the silver. Right. The gold is much more valuable. Keep that in mind, because what's more valuable is what's in the world to come. And everything you gain in this world can be used for something more valuable in the world to come. Think about this. In Luke 16, the first parable that we see is about a man who is a steward. Now, the rich man in that parable obviously is not God. The idea is that the steward is an agent of the one he works for, or the one that he sent him. And this steward uses the rich man's stuff to increase his own means, his own capacity, doesn't it? Only for himself. He does nothing to glorify the one he is an agent of. Consider that we are agents of the Most High. Do we use what we have to expand his kingdom or our kingdom? Because this is something that the rich man in the parable that we are going to look at doesn't understand. This is something that the Pharisees had lost sight of. What you have in this world is used to expand what there will be for you in the next world. Now, even there, if that's the way you're seeing it, well, I can be rich here or rich there, you're on a very low level of interpretation, a very low level of understanding, because you're still only seeing yourself. What you have seen is the heavenly kingdom's better than the worldly kingdom, but what you have forgotten is that your love of the Father himself, that the idea that you're doing this first and foremost to glorify him, to know that you have glorified him to the utmost of your ability as an act of gratitude and love. Goes on to say, but let him that glory in this, that he understandeth and knoweth me, that I am the Lord, which exercise loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, saith the Lord. The stewardship, well within the stewardship, in the first parable in Luke 16, we also see where that steward, he reduces the prices back down to their real price, at which the master's name is restored, at which he showed himself, because that would have all reflected badly on the master, poorly on the master, just as like what we do in our lives is a reflection of who we are an agent of. And he talks about him. And I didn't see it when I first preached this first parable in Luke 16, but there's the idea of being welcomed into heavenly tabernacles or everlasting tabernacles. And that's the same idea aligned with, excuse me, gang, I'm a little bit caffeinated up this morning. The idea that your earthly possessions, earthly silver, heavenly gold, it's even there in the first parable. I want to move forward. This is something to keep in mind. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, Bava Batra 44 AC, and this is wonderful because this comes from the Talmud, obviously, the Babylonian Talmud, and yet this thought so amazingly describes what's going on in this parable. It goes on, that is in line with what happened to Yosef, Yehoshua. He fell sick and went into a coma. Afterwards his father said unto him, so what did you see? He said, I saw an upside down world. What is on high is down below, and what is below is on high. He said to him, you saw a world of clarity. In other words, he saw a picture of heaven. He was in a coma. He saw a picture of heaven. But this was so strange, because in heaven, the things that we value down here were of no consequence. They were the things that we valued down here, the things that were important down here, the things that mattered to the flesh, there's your key, the flesh down here were of no value up there. But down here, we value other things than are valued up there. He said, things were upside down in heaven. If things are upside down in heaven, that makes earth the source and heaven the copy. At which point the imperfections are always in the copy, not in the source. So what did the Father tell him? He says, no, what you saw was clarity. He says, you saw the world right side up. Where you live is upside down. This is something to keep in mind as we go through this parable. Since I haven't written all the other teachings, I may come back to this. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus serves as a striking contrast, and that's one of the things that people don't understand is people look at this parable and go, "Oh, them evil rich people." You know, gang, if you find your blood boiling, you find yourself getting a little worked up and getting ready to just, waiting to see the rich man get his comeuppance. I want you to truly check yourself, because there's probably a root of envy or jealousy. And this is not a parable against rich people. This is a parable of people who do not have the understanding of which world is right side up and which world is upside down. This is a parable dealing with resources. And with those resources, whether it's knowledge, whether it's talents, whether it's possessions, we could just say your allness. Or we could use a Hebrew word and say your kol. What did I just lead you into? I led you into the Shema. You are to worship your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, and with all your strength. The idea is you're to serve God with your allness. All those things are part of you. And the means within this parable that's used to demonstrate that point is a monetary matter of exchange, a monetary value, because it's easiest to show it within that context, as well as there is an applicable case to certain groups of the Pharisees. Make sure we're not throwing out blanket statements here. So what we've got is it's about poorly utilized resources to expand one's own kingdom as opposed to the Father's, and not necessarily a blanket statement against rich people. Whereas the manager used money wisely to obtain a secure future, the rich man is an outstanding example of the misuse of wealth, consequently failing to procure a welcome into eternal habitations. Remember earlier, I told you there's connections. Yeshua is constantly preaching to these people. There is a great love for these people. The Pharisees were seen as the teachers of the people. They weren't learning from the Sadducees. The Essene community over at the Dead Sea was a very closed community. You'd spend 3 years before you were truly accepted in, if you made it that far. And even then, they were just their own little group. The Pharisees were the ones that were teaching. Yeshua doesn't correct the bastard children, does he? He's looking to try and get this point home. And in this parable, we come to the end, the death. So if it comes to the death, when people are looking at this parable and they're getting all their end-time theology, they're getting all their theology on hell, they're getting all their theology on heaven and paradise and purgatory and what have you, they're pulling it all from this parable. That's not what this was designed to do. This is driving home the final point. You weren't getting it anywhere along the line from Luke 15:1 all the way down now. I know that you take death and life serious, so I am going to bring it to its most serious point, and hopefully you can grab it at that point. Because after that, if you haven't got it, you're not going to get it. If I bring a case to you on a minor severity, yeah, whatever, and I come back, and I raise the severity of the issue I bring. Whatever. I keep raising the severity of the situation. Sooner or later, I'm going to have your attention. If the severity is brought to you, and maybe it's a health thing, where I say, hey, you need to see a doctor because such and such a people died from the very thing you're not dealing with. They went through the same things. Now it's a matter of life and death, isn't it? Now there's an urgency. Now I've got your attention, don't I? Yeshua is bringing the same thing in the same manner to these people so that they might realize the severity of the condition they have. Because humankind has a propensity towards life, doesn't it? Wants to sustain that life. It's one of the reasons the Sabbath can be violated, is to make sure, and everybody agreed on that, the propagation of life, that life should go on. To save a life, for health reasons, there were certain things that, you had to do to make sure you stayed alive, you didn't get harmed. That brings the message home. That's what I want you to see from this last parable. That's what Yeshua wanted you to see from this last parable. Not to get all your end times, your heaven and hell and purgatory, which the Catholic Church made up, I'm sorry to say, but Abraham's bosom, not to get all your philosophy and based all that on that. That's to drive the point to the finality of the matter, to where you realize the severity of the situation, because that's going to get your attention. But if you start there, you're an extremist. Nobody wants to hear you.
Right.
In 16:9, he says, And I say unto you, make unto yourself friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, and remember we talked about in that parable that when it fails, when that money fails, it fails when you die. It can't do anything anymore for you, or when you're broke. They may receive you into everlasting habitations, earthly silver, heavenly gold. The parable that follows in 19 verses 19 to 31 is but another example of this intensification of the law. The Pharisees, who were not necessarily of the wealthy class. Now, see, people, this is where they wrestle. They go, we're dealing with a rich man, but the Pharisees really weren't that rich. And they're saying, so this must have been to the Sadducees. Well, didn't Yeshua say he doesn't correct the bastard children? He didn't spend a lot of time talking to the Sadducees. They had no use for a resurrection. They had no use for a life after this one. They couldn't see it. They didn't believe in it. He wasn't going to be received. This is talking about the Pharisees. But let's look and see what's going on. The Pharisees, who are not necessarily of the wealthy class, and who certainly held to a doctrine of charity, are nonetheless rebuked for being lovers of money. Think about this. Do you remember in the Gospel of Luke that there was a widow who only put in 2 pence? What a small amount she put in. Remember that parable? The Pharisees, they put in comparison, a lot more, didn't they? Do you remember what Yeshua told them? He says, you put in out of excess. You had a lot in comparison to this woman, right? And you just put in a small fraction. What you put in may impress a lot of these people because it's a decent sized amount with what they have. But proportionally what this woman put in was all she had. That's what's being talked about. The Pharisees, when this says the love of money, when it talks about they were covetousness, it deals with their love for money was the love that money could do to serve themselves and not the kingdom. That's what's at issue. That's the point you're supposed to see. Not that they were extremely wealthy. This is thus what is at issue is not their wealth as such, but their hypocritical attitude to money. The parable therefore serves to intensify the law as understood by the Pharisees. Remember, they were the teachers of the law, regarding the use of wealth and concern for the poor, for it does not permit a mere external piety. In other words, something just for show, right?
Right.
And that's always a danger. Luke announced that the Pharisees are lovers of money, who ridiculed Jesus for insisting you cannot serve God and wealth, In other words, he uses the phrase mammon to show an adultery going on because he's talking about mammon. He doesn't just say money. He brings up an Aramaic name for a god and says basically this is your god. Is that a point that is going to hit home? Is that of a lower intensity or a higher intensity? That's a pretty high intensity, isn't it? That's something they're going to pay attention to. Yeshua responds by accusing them of self-righteousness. Money-loving, see 1 Timothy 6:10. I'm not going to do that. A conventional charge again connects the Pharisees with wealth. Josephus in Antiquities 13:171-173 states the Pharisees simplify their standard of living, making no concession to luxury. So we're seeing that they weren't the Rockefellers, so to speak. They were people who did what they did out of love for the Torah, out of concern for the people. But we all have blind spots, don't we?
Right.
Yeshua's addressing blind spots, that they still fall victim to greed. You know, I don't care what your political affiliation is, what your political ideologies are. But when you look at all governmental systems and all forms of government, what you're going to find is what they're actually dealing with is how do we deal with the issue of greed? Because greed, is it illegal to be greedy? No. But it really makes you mad because they're making too much money. Or we're not making enough money, right? So you try and put someone else in charge that's going to be fair. Gang, greed is a condition that exists in people's hearts. The government, this is what I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you where I stand on this because this is not a political platform. The government that best addresses and utilizes the greed the greed that is in people's hearts for the most good is the government that will be the most successful. That doesn't necessarily make it a godly government, and it doesn't mean that when Yeshua sets up his government, it's going to be anything like it, because Yeshua is the only one who can truly set up a government that is truly fair. He's the only one qualified. So any type of government we have deals best, that makes the best use of greed for everyone, because we all have it. Those who are in control and those who are not in control simply want to be in control and nonetheless are motivated by greed. Back to the beginning. Where's the beginning? In the beginning. No, we're not going back that far. We're going back to the situation that started this whole thing out, and that's in Luke 15:1-2. We talked a lot about this in the last teaching, where we rebooted the prodigal of what is commonly called the prodigal son. And it says, Then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. And in that parable, in the last week's teaching, we taught about how there was this belief that, hey, you know, those who honor the Torah and keep the Torah, there are blessings that are added to them, right? That is a blessed thing. But there are those who don't keep the Torah, and things don't go so well. So therefore, the sick must not be keeping Torah. The poor must not be keeping Torah. That's their due comeuppance. If they're not on the same level, it's because they're not keeping Torah. This is part of the mindset of what's going on. Let's keep that in mind as we move forward. As Pharisees whose religion was of the book, their love of wealth found its confirmation in the law and the prophets. Exactly what I was just talking about. Whoever is careful to obey the commands of God shall be highly favored. We see this in a movement called the prosperity movement within the church. But what do they lose sight of? They lose sight of the fact that, yes, that money may come into your being. You don't use it to justify yourself in front of your neighbors. See, well, I've got fruit. Isn't that what they call in the prosperity movement? I'm doing well, I've got fruit. No, you've got the ability to do a lot more for the kingdom. We'll get into that. We'll close the teaching with something like that, and I'll show you what's at heart of that straight from the works of the fathers. For those of you who understand my code that I'm talking there, you'll know that I'm talking about Pirkei Avot. As Pharisees whose religion was of the book, their love of wealth found its confirmation in the law and the prophets. Whoever is careful to obey the commands of God shall be highly favored. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. You probably heard that if you're in the prosperity movement, and you're probably not thinking too highly of me right now, but as God works on your heart and softens your heart, you'll benefit from receiving what He's got for you from this. He said, blessed shall be the fruit of your body, and the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your beasts, and the increase of your cattle, and the young of your flock. This is from Deuteronomy 28, verses 3 to 4. And there are other verses throughout Scripture where you could build such doctrine, all the time forgetting that gives you the ability to expand this kingdom or His kingdom. The equations are quite clear to them. Wealth equals blessed of God, obedience to God's commands. But there's a theology assumed in the parable that Luke is attacking, a theology that says one who delights in God's law and all that he does prospers, but the wicked, not so much. You can see this for yourself if you want to go to Psalms chapter 1, verses 3 to 4. And this would be the mindset, this rich man would see a poor man laying down at his gate. He's hungry, he's got sores, he's in really rough shape. He doesn't even have the strength to beg for all practical purposes. Mm-hmm. Oh, he's got to be accursed of God. He's got to be accursed of God. With that type of mindset, you can walk by him all day, can't you? Yeah. Right. We're going to see something else here. There was a certain man who habitually clothed himself in purple and fine linen, and reveled and feasted and made merry in splendor every day. There is a reason I chose the Amplified for this verse, in that word habitually, it is in brackets, it's not actually there, but there's a form of the word which shows that this was his lifestyle. This was something that he did every day. This wasn't, a special time of year, so we got all dressed up and put on our best and, just made the most of it because it's a special occasion? No. This is another day ending in Y, if that's a special occasion. A certain rich man. We're going to cover the rich man first. There was a certain rich man. He is left nameless, perhaps to imply that his name was not written in heaven. And there's a number of things that people like this, where they go down this avenue. And they get this from Luke 10:20. Notwithstanding in this rejoice, that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. There is a part of the truth in this. Okay? There's a reason I say part. A minor part of the whole. If you may, because I look at a slightly different thing that I believe is behind the whole thing. And that's why I say, or maybe, let's look at Proverbs 22, 1-9. And if you've got your Bible open to this parable in Luke 16, you might even want to stop this here and go back and forth and compare the two. Because look at this. A good name is rather to be chosen. A rich man and a poor man. Which one is named? The poor man. His name is Lazarus. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. Right there. Remember I told you it's contrasts? Right. And loving favor rather than silver and gold. The rich and poor meet together. The Lord is the maker of them all. Is that a finality? Absolutely. Does this parable end in a finality? Absolutely. A prudent man foresees the evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. What does the rich man do? Feasts sumptuously every day, goes upon in the finest clothes, probably better than anyone else in the community, After all, this poor man is placed at the gate of the person who is in the best position to help him, but yet this person is only concerned with their own little world, expanding their own kingdom. It says, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches. What's that? That's the heavenly gold, isn't it? And honor and life. It's showing you where the true riches are. Thorns and snare are in the way of the froward. He that does keep his soul shall be far from them. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. See, people, how many times have you used that verse for something, and you don't bring it back into the context? You just seen something, and you go, that one verse, apart from the rest of what's going on here, fits my situation. So you use that, and you build some stuff around that, and you try and make it fit without seeing what it was as a part of the whole. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The rich ruleth over the poor. Isn't that what's going on here? Mm-hmm. Is another poor man going to be able to help Lazarus? If he could, he would have been placed at the gate of another poor man, wouldn't he? He's placed there, and we'll get into that. He's placed there because that was where he is most likely going to get the help he needs. And the borrower is servant to the lender. He that sows iniquity shall reap vanity. You seen how this parable ends? Does that happen? Oh, absolutely. And the rod of his anger shall fare. He that hath a bountiful eye. You know, you're dealing with how you deal with your resources. You're dealing with hospitality there. It's not a matter of good and evil. A good eye dealt with how you dealt with your resources. We taught about that in what is commonly taught as the Lord's Prayer, but in actuality it's the disciples' prayer, a type of Amidah, if you will. For he giveth of his bread to the who? To his friends the rich. No, to the poor. You see the concept? Earthly silver for heavenly gold. This is what I believe seriously underlies this last parable. In Pirkei Avot 4:17, now this is once again, that's works of the fathers. It says, Rabbi Simeon said there are three crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. But the crown of a good name mounts above them. Example of the rich man's wealth. 1, he was clothed in purple. He was clothed in fine linen, and he fared sumptuously every day. He's dealing with banquets, celebration, large, jovial festivals every day. So let's look at this a little closer. He was clothed in purple. Purple, this is one of the marks of wealth. Purple is a term used by the ancients to include 3 distinct colors, namely a deep violet with a black or dusky tinge, a deep scarlet or crimson, the Tyrian purple, and the deep blue of the Mediterranean. The dye of the purple was fadeless and retained its freshness of color. Gang, if you've ever dealt with colors, purples, pinks, reds, fade. You need a very good pigment to make sure that those colors aren't going to fade. Am I correct? Anybody who's had a Ford in the 70s, if you remember your Ford Mavericks. I used to have a 70 Ford Maverick growing up, and that sucker, that faded to like a very, very bright, pale pink as time went on. And if you're in southern Texas like we are, that's going to happen sooner rather than later. Purple is also an emblem of royalty. You see a little bit of what's going on. Remember, this rich man, he's dressed in this every day. How does he see himself? He sees himself as royalty, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. In this case, as in the Pharisees. He sees himself as highly favored of God. This is what we're looking at for royalty. Fine linen was yellowish flax, and the linen made from it was considered to be of the finest quality. Look at this. It was used in making the tabernacle. He's wearing this every day. He can be seen every day wearing this. The idea is, look at me. I am highly favored of God. Look at me. Be like me. Dang, this is a parable, so we don't want to draw too much from it. But do you see the attitude that's being portrayed here? Do you see where the Pharisees might not all be yippee-skippy with Yeshua right about now? Because they're catching what he is trying to explain to him. Give you an idea how fine some of this stuff was. Some of the Egyptian was so fine that it was called woven air. Later this term was applied to cotton and silken goods. So you've got this rich man dressed in the most expensive attire in an extremely poor neighborhood, thinking he's serving as an example of God's finest. Do you see the irony in that? Serving as God's finest, walking by the man who needs the help that he could freely give from a pittance of what he has. You know, like what he put in the offering in a different parable of Luke, and compared to the woman who only put in 2 mites. That would have helped Lazarus. Can you say, ow? Purple, although imitation purple dye existed, the dominant source of the dye came from crushing Murex shellfish around Thai. It was necessarily expensive. One source estimates 10,000 shellfish to produce a single gram of the dye. Why did I bring that up? I want you to see why it's so expensive. Is that an obscure fact that nobody would know? No, people would be aware just how much it cost to make that. People would see that. They would know it was real. The man wearing it would know it was real. He would know it could be seen. Robe so dyed, not surprisingly, carried a strong odor. But purple's expense made it a status symbol. Remember earlier we talked about that status symbol of royalty. Not of earthly royalty, right? Because they believed that the thing of their goodness came from God. Therefore, they saw themselves as highly favored of God. Wow. Now, this Greek phrase that I would butcher if I tried, dealing with, and he used to dress in purple and fine linen, the imperfect tense suggests habitual conduct. He dressed like this every day. There are things we see that when we get into the actual language spoken, gang, I know this is going to be hard for some of you to hear, but the Gospels, the New Testament, and the Old Testament were not written in English. When we get into the languages that they were written and look at the form of the words used, we see the tense to which they were describing, and we get a more complete picture, don't we? Very important to do, because this suggests, and it's why I used the Amplified in the beginning, to show it was something that was part of his daily routine. Fine linen, also known as byssus. This is the fine linen from Egypt. You've got scriptural examples there, and this gives you an idea of just how much, in addition to what we already talked about, how valuable this was, a robe of which was worth twice its own weight in gold. Linen was one of the most important fabrics for the Israelites. It was made from the flax plant, which was cultivated especially for that purpose. The Canaanites grew flax in Palestine just before the Israelites conquered that country. You can see this in Joshua 2:6. Linen was a versatile fabric that could be made coarse and thick, or very fine and delicate. So it can be made in different ways. Obviously, if it's very fine and delicate, that's going to cost you some more, isn't it? That's a much finer if it's going to be woven air, so to speak. The Egyptians had a wide reputation for their fine linen, which was nearly transparent. They also made coarse linen that was so heavy that it could be used for carpets to cover the floors. Gives you an idea of the range which this could be. The fine linen fabrics were worn by those with positions of status or wealth, and the coarser fabrics were worn by the common people. The Egyptians clothed Joseph in fine linen when they made him ruler. In Genesis 41, verse 42, the curtains, veil, and door hangings of the Hebrew tabernacle were made of fine linen. Isn't that something? And that's what this guy is wearing. See where he's showing himself of heavenly royalty? As were the hangings for the gate of the court and the court itself. The ephod and breastplate of the high priest contained the fine linen. Okay, this is an undergarment he's wearing. The tunic, girdle, and the breeches worn by all priests were made of fine white linen. The Jews made their inner garments or underclothing primarily of linen. The grave clothes of Yeshua were made from this fabric. Scripture says that Joseph of Arimathea bought fine linen and took him down and wrapped him in the linen. But here's something else. What was it also a status of? Fine white linen was also a symbol of innocence and moral purity. How do you think the Pharisees are receiving Yeshua right now? There could be three ways you could receive that. You could take offense. You can't truly be offended because I don't believe truth can offend you. But you can always take offense. They could be convicted, right? Which is what it was designed to do. Or indifferent. Those are the three choices. And I'm guessing indifferent wasn't really an option in this case. They either took offense or they were convicted. But gang, do you think they got the message? They heard it. They definitely heard it. They definitely understood the significance of why Yeshua included these details. And he fared sumptuously every day. Now remember, earlier in the Gospel of Luke, there was a bridge between the parables. And in that bridge, we talked about the importance of the breaker. And that people are breaking into the kingdom. And this is an exciting thing, right? Because people are not only breaking into the kingdom, these people are valuable in the eyes of God. Extremely valuable. And this should be an exciting thing. Ties right back in with the prodigal son, isn't it? Your brother's home. Everything you've had. You've always been with me. Everything I've always had has always been yours. You've always been here. You should be happy. Your brother's back from the what? The dead. You see the tie-in. In the part where we talked about the bridge within this parable, it lined up with those people are breaking into the kingdom. These were people who weren't here. These are the sinners. These are the people that you were worried about, that you were lambasting in 15 verses 1 and 2. They're coming into the kingdom. That's an exciting thing. But what else does he tell them right after that? He says, the law and prophets are still intact, aren't they? He says they're not going to fade away, are they? Till heaven and earth, they still stand. Then he gave them an example of an area where they weren't keeping the Torah. The teachers of the Torah, mind you. You had to go through their halakha, their Torah, to be considered righteous. He gave them an example in divorce where they weren't keeping their Torah. Gang, we're going to see another example, couple examples within this parable where they're not keeping Torah. This all builds to the final culmination which comes in this parable. You can go back through 15 and 16 and you can look, and it all leads down to the inevitable last parable. They all tie in. Watch this. To make merry, used in two other parables, means to make a feast. Isn't that what the father does when his son comes home? This is a joyous occasion. My son was dead. He's home. This father was so happy when he seen the prodigal son, who had in his mind everything he was going to say to the father, that before the son could even get there, in a Middle Eastern culture of the first century, takes off running. If the son is crawling and the father's running, gang, the father is covering more ground than the son. The father already knows by the mere act that the son is coming back, that he's coming back in repentance, that he's coming back low and humbled. He realizes his mistake. He realizes the error of his ways, and he is repentant. Hadn't even got to the father yet, but the father knows what's going on. That calls for a feast. That calls for a feast. This person in this parable, uses his earthly silver to throw a feast for no other reason than he can. That's why he throws it. Because he can. To make merry, used in two other parables, means to make a feast. So you see a difference there. It entails a feast well beyond those occasional celebrations that enliven the otherwise boring and monotonous existence of Mediterranean peasants. Not only is the feasting sumptuous, but it takes place every day. Wow, what a contrast between the father whose son is now considered alive again. That calls for this feast, where this rich man, no thanks to God. He's not thanking God for these feasts. There's no honoring God. Who is there honoring? Himself, right? Moving forward. In addition to his purple robes and expensive underpinnings, the man feasted sumptuously every day. Watch this. He did not. Remember, the Pharisees were the teachers of the law. It was their halakha by which you were judged righteous. As far as they were concerned, they were the teachers of the people. He did not, therefore, observe the Sabbath. Ow! His servants were never given a day of rest. Somebody's got to prepare these sumptuous feasts. And if it's every day, they're working, aren't they? Right. He's causing other people to violate the Torah. And thereby he publicly violated the Ten Commandments every week. His self-indulgent lifestyle was more important to him than the law of God. Go back to that bridge between the parables. And then look at this and you can see the tie-in. Now, if this is the injustice he inflicted on his staff, meant nothing to him, can you see what he must think of Lazarus? I mean, these people at least provide a service. Lazarus would be seen as a burden. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, was laid at his gate full of sores. Now, Lazarus is the one who's given a name. Remember, we went to Proverbs 22. Might even be a good time to stop the teaching and look at Proverbs 22 again. Because Lazarus wasn't just given a name, he was given a pretty good name. I'd say if that your name was God helps, one who God helps, that's a pretty good name. Because who else can help Lazarus? Well, the rich man could if he wanted to. Right? But Lazarus can't help himself, as we will see. Lazarus isn't even in a position to break a lot of the Torah. If all he can do is lay at the gate and hope for an existence, a large part of the Torah he doesn't have to worry about breaking, because the parts you can't keep for whatever reason, are not held against you. Torah keeping on his level is very low because there's very little of Torah that he can or cannot have to worry about keeping. He's basically existing, isn't he? He can't get his help. God's the only one that will help Lazarus. It's also a shortened form of the name Eliezer or Eleazar, or Eliezer, the name of Abraham's servant in Genesis 15:2. We'll get into the importance of that later. And as we go on, we see the significance of Lazarus' name, which was laid at the gate. In 16:20, it's described that he was laid there, but you need to see that this wasn't his idea. Lazarus didn't come to the conclusion, says, well, if I just lay at the gate of the rich man, that maybe he'll see me. He doesn't have that ability. Is he helpless by the world standards? Absolutely. Is he helpless by the community standard? You better believe it. Is this something that bothers the community, that pains the community? You better believe it does, because the community picks him up and lays him there every day. This is an expression frequently used to describe the sick and the lame. The community is placing him there at the gate because that's the best they can do. If they could do better, they would feed him. They would take care of him, but they don't have the means. The best that they can do for Lazarus is put him in a position where somebody who has the means to help him can help him. God does Lazarus a justice, a love, a kindness by taking him into Abraham's bosom. On earth, beyond what the community does for Lazarus, the only help he receives is from dogs. We'll get into that in a little bit, which is quite interesting. Full of sores. Where did he get these sores? Because people say, well, he was leprous. And then, of course, if you're going to open the leprous thing, you're going to say, well, he was leprous because he didn't do this, he didn't do that, or he said this. You know, he was guilty of lashon hara, evil speech, right? But that's not what's going on here. The word translated full of sores is a regular medical term for it to be ulcerated. Okay, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Let's see what we got on the next screen. It had been laid at his gate. The perfect tense of ibleto denotes the result of laying down rather than the act. So he had been laid there by other people, which we'd covered. But as we go further, when it says covered with sore, it's a past participle to cause sores. So where did those sores come from? Simply laying on the ground by the gate, having the inability to move. Gang, if you lay on the ground all day, every day, if you are placed there, if you're incapable of moving, you're going to develop sores. Did Lazarus do anything to bring these sores upon himself? No. This shows you the condition he is in. This shows you the plight of this man. That your heart just aches for. You want to reach out. If you're hearing this, you want to reach out. You want to be able to do something. And you're sitting there wondering, thinking, well, this rich man's got to do something. How can he pass by? You know? The community sees him and says, you know, if we could do something, we would do something. But this is all we can do. If you're the Pharisees, this is hard to hear. This is hard to hear. And God teaches in the manner of contrasts, right? To get their attention. To bring it from one extreme to the other. The rich man has got the best of the clothes. He's obviously got a beautiful, beautiful, expensive place if he's got this huge ornamental gate, which is going to overview a courtyard where everybody can see him in his fine attire every day. Lazarus has got what? A name. He's not there because of some sin he committed. The rich man will not be punished because of his richness. Do you see the contrast? The rich man has everything by the world's standards. The poor man has nothing by the world's standards, but has everything by heavenly standards. He's got a name, which means God helps. Ties right back to Proverbs 22. Second, the location of the gate. This was the gate of the rich man in a parable. There was no provision made for the helpless poor in those days, and consequently they were often laid at the gates of the rich and places of public resort for charity. If everybody's got nothing, but you have the ability to carry him and put him in a place where he might be helped, that's the best you can do. And that's what's going on. We had talked about this. This person, this Lazarus, he is definitely hungry. He can't fend for himself. He's dependent upon the charity of others just to get by. And this is in desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. This is going to remind you of the Syrophoenician woman, I believe in the Gospel of Mark. This is also going to remind you of the prodigal son, isn't it? Remember? He went to work for a man in a faraway country, and things got to the point where he longed for the stuff that the pigs eat, for food. Let's move forward. Covered with sores, Lazarus was too weak to work or sit up, and he desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. The verb desired is used in Luke's gospel for something a person wants but is unable to have. The prodigal son in Luke 15:16 desired to eat the pods which he was feeding to the pigs, but he did not have a stomach that could digest them. In the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, food was thrown away in the rich man's house, but it wasn't given to Lazarus. As a reference is made to leftovers from meals, a Middle Easterner immediately thinks of the estate's guard dogs, who are the natural recipients of the remnants of any meal. Wow. Be interesting to look at the Syrophoenician woman, wouldn't it? It really would. You see where this ties back to Luke 15:16. In other words, in Luke 15:16, that prodigal son, as he's often called, would just love to eat what when you thought of an unclean animal, you thought of one of two animals. First, the pig, and he says, I would just love to eat what the pigs eat, just to survive. Now this man, you can wait till you see to find out what he would long to eat, because the other unclean animal that most commonly come to mind would be the dog. And in Judaism, even before it was called Judaism, if you were going to refer to those outside of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the community of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you would refer to them by one of two names: pigs or dogs. To give you an idea of another, just how disparaging these animals were in this culture. Here, in 15, you're looking for pig food, even pig food. Prodigal 16, or in in Luke 16, you're looking basically for dog food, aren't you?
Right.
Wow, there's more. Food was eaten with the hands, not utensils. Here's what the food was. Here's what he was longing to eat. Wasn't steak, wasn't the finest of the fine. Food was eaten with the hands, not utensils. In Jesus' time, in order to cleanse the hands during the meal, the wealthy used hunks of bread. They're wiping their hands off on hunks of bread to clean their hands. The bread was then dropped on the floor. Here describes as crumbs which fell. The beggar waited for the bread to fall so that he could eat it. I'd say that's fairly humble, wouldn't you? That really sets the mind to thinking, doesn't it? This guy, just something, anything. As we go later on in the parable, a man vanquishing in hell. I'm sure you've read the parable, so you already know that's a rich man. What does he long for? Just a drop of cool water. You see the tie-in. Do you remember what we talked about? About the topsy-turvy world. Which world's up right side up and which world's upside down. But even the dogs, this is an adversative. This is our versions have the correct feeling when they avoid but and translate moreover, like the Authorized Version or the King James, or as in the Revised Version. This is the copulative, which merely carries the description forward by adding a striking detail. This is the fact that the dogs kept coming and licking the ulcers. These are ownerless dogs and roam the city and act as general scavengers and are known in all Oriental cities where they have not been abolished. See, we've got dogs and their pets, or we call them fur babies, or we consider them as part of the family, but it's not like that in the first century. I know earlier we talked about the guy may have had guard dogs. We don't know. It is a parable. Nonetheless, who do you think was getting that food that fell from the master's table? Probably the dogs. They're in a much better position. If you ever drop something, if you've got dogs, I know we've got a little terrier, and I go to throw little treats to the dogs, and anything they miss, boom, she gets it. I don't even have to throw her treats. As I'm throwing treats to the other dogs, they can't catch, she gets it. She probably gets fed the most. So you see what's going on here. There is a dispute as to whether this licking of the ulcers was an affliction or an alleviation. It marks the abject state of the beggar. It was so low that such dogs were his only friends. Remember what I told you about dogs? Wow. Does that say something? Is that a loud commentary? That the people who are looked at as outcasts, the people who you would ascribe a term to insult them, to denigrate them, to say, they're not like us. That's who does this guy a mercy. That is where he is receiving his only earthly kindness. Oh, by the way, in case you're wondering if that's just a strange thing that only comes up here, how would the Samaritans have been viewed in the first century? Might you apply the phrase dogs or pigs to them? Might they be denigrated in your eyes? You better believe it. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, who's the one who does the right thing? The Samaritan. He's the one that shows the compassion, that shows the kindness. The heroes you would have been expecting, when you heard the cast of characters in that parable, or that play, if you will, you already had in your mind who the good guy and who the bad guy was, only to find out the guy you thought was bound and determined to be the bad guy was the only one who did the right thing, was the only one who showed compassion, who was the only one who fulfilled the Torah, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might, and with all your soul, and to love the neighbor as yourself. Upside down and right side up. The views that they aggravated his ulcers, that he was too weak to fend them off, which he would be, he can't even move from the spot he's in, or that they treat him as an almost being a carcass, reveal a lack of dog knowledge. These dogs licked the beggar sore as they would have licked their own to clean and ease them with their soft tongues. Dogs did that. No one else would. Now, keep in mind that the community is bringing in a compassion just by laying him at the gate, because they know they can't provide for him, so they put him in a place where he could. But the ones who bring him the most relief of anything that's getting anything done are these wild dogs. We're going to look in a little bit, and dogs were not really referred to positively in Scripture at all. In reference to these dogs reads, but the dogs came and licked his sores, the Greek word Allah always indicates a contrast. Invariably, the English language tradition has understood the dog's actions to be in harmony with the cruelty of the rich man. Just piling on. He's suffering this from the rich man because the rich man won't do anything, and then the dogs come and add to his misery. Gang, if you think you're seeing tie-ins to Job, I didn't bring them in here, but it's not because they don't exist. It's because I'd never get done. And that would lead me on another rabbit trail, and that would lead me on another rabbit trail. There's often times I've looked at the book of Job and I want to reteach because I do see a number of tie-ins to the Gospels as well as the lives of the Pharisees into the book of Job. But that's a teaching in and of its own. That's a series in and of its own. The Greek word Allah always indicates a contrast. Invariably, the English language tradition has understood the dog's action to be in harmony with the cruelty of the rich man, and thus the Revised Standard Version translates the text as, "Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores," which indicates continuity with the rich man's behavior. But you get the feeling I'm going to take you somewhere else just by bringing this up, don't you? And if that's what you think, you're right. The New Revised Standard Version and New International Version state even the dogs came, which also places the dogs on the side of Lazarus' tormentors. But for more than 1,000 years, most Arabic versions have accurately translated the Greek word Allah as a contrast, and thereby emphasize that the dogs were not joining the rich man in tormenting Lazarus. The contrast is clear in the Greek text and is important to the story. Dogs lick their own wounds. They lick people as a sign of affection. But more than this, the recent scientific scholarship has identified that saliva contains, there's a word I don't use every day, endogenous peptide antibiotics which facilitate healing. A dog's saliva contains such peptide antibiotics, and the ancients somehow discovered that if a dog licked wounds, they would heal more rapidly. Dogs in the Middle East, remember I told you, doesn't look too good for them in Scripture, are not pets. Elsewhere in Scripture, they are always seen in a negative light. You have Scripture references there. It would do you well to look them up. And often mentioned in connection with another unclean animal, pigs. In the early Jewish tradition, dogs were considered almost unclean as pigs. Remember I told you if you were going to look at a community of people or group of people outside your own community of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that you would most likely look at them disparaging as pigs first or dogs. But there is much to ponder. Ibn al-Tayyib, the monk, biblical scholar, and medical doctor, comments, I understand that the licking of Lazarus' sores gave him relief and eased his pain. This reminds us that the silent, unspeaking animals felt compassion for him, and they helped him and cared for him more than the humans. Wow. He was naked without medical attention other than what he received from the dogs. This demonstrates that the rich man did not receive him or give him any attention at all. Thus, when we compare the rich man's condition to that of Lazarus, we see the first was clothed with purple and linen. Remember I talked about the contrast. The second was naked and covered with sores. The first luxuriated every day with a banquet, while the second longed for scraps of bread. The first had many servants ready to satisfy all his needs, and the other had no servants other than dogs. The contrast between the two men is drawn as strongly as possible because that's going to drive the message home. That's going to get your attention. That is going to get to you the severity of the message you are about to hear. The clothing and the feasting of the rich man is contrasted with the hunger and wretched condition of the poor man. Such contrast would have been commonplace within the walls of every pre-industrial city. You're taking stories from everyday life that people can relate, that people can understand. Linen underwear imported from Egypt was extremely expensive, as was purple cloth. Degraded persons such as Lazarus, his Hebrew name means one God has helped, constituted about 5% of the population, and most lived just outside the city walls. They begged in the city at the daytime, but were put out of the city at night when the gates were locked. The house of the rich man was itself walled in, as many of the elite houses were, so that its gate could be closed at night. Lazarus was apparently used to begging in this elite section of city during the daytime, since the rich man, you see that, knows him by name. If you know him by name, you can't claim you don't know he's there. I want to look at, remember the Pharisees were the teachers of the Torah. Yeshua himself can be seen through the eyes of Pharisaical interpretation. He would have used Pharisaic methods for teaching Torah. And the group in a best position to receive him would have been the Pharisees. Mm-hmm. Remember, in the bridge between the parables, we talked about how the Torah was still valid. And as the Pharisees from the teacher of the Torah, let's look at a few of the things that they should have known. Leviticus 19, 9-10. What? I could have just left it right at this and done commentary on this. Because the summation of the Torah, as we see in the Gospels, hangs on two things, doesn't it? Hangs on the Shema and Leviticus 19. People only see Leviticus 19:18, but in the first century, chapter and verse wasn't given. If you referred to something, you referred to the wholeness of it. Leviticus 19 starts off with, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." They are instructions on how to be holy. They are a summation of the Torah between that and the Shema, because those are the two things quoted. They're what the law and the prophets hang on. And within those instructions on being holy, we find, "And when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field. Neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." God, no matter who you are, wants to know you're taken care of, doesn't he? And the people who have means of this world are used to take care of the people who don't have means of this world, and God intended it that way. In Deuteronomy 15, 7-11, "If there be among you a poor man of one of thy brethren within any of thy gates," oh boy, "in thy land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not harden thine heart," like walk by him without doing anything, "nor shut thine hand from thy poor brother, but thou shalt open thine hand wide unto him, and shalt surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wanteth. Beware that there not be a thought in thy wicked heart, saying, dun dun dun, the seventh year, the year of release is at hand, and thine eye be evil against him, against thy poor brother, and thou givest him nothing, and he cries unto the Lord against thee, and it be sin unto thee. Thou shalt surely give him, and thine heart shall not be grieved when thou givest him, because that for this thing the Lord thy God shall bless thee in all thy works, and all thou puttest thine hand unto, for the poor shall never cease out of a land. Therefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, and to thy needy in the land." Gang, you know what I'm actually wondering? I'm wondering, by the time Yeshua finished the parable, just how many Pharisees were still standing there. I can see number of points where, if they were taking offense as opposed to being convicted, where they would have walked out and left. I mean, I'm curious to see how many would have still been standing there by the time he even started this parable, not to mention how many had left between that. From the prophets, Isaiah 58, 6-11. "Is not this the fast I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to deal thy bread to the who? Hungry? and that thou bringest the poor that are cast out to thy house? And when thou seest the naked, that thou cover him? And thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and then thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. Remember I talked about seeing Scripture, seeing things, and you can see, okay, I'm getting this reward, I'm getting that reward in heaven. What does it say here? The glory of the Lord shall be their reward. The love of God, the knowing that His kingdom's being expanded. It shows you where you're at in your love of God, as opposed to your love of self, and you may not want to hear it, but I promise you, you need to. Then thou shalt call, and the Lord shall answer. And thou shalt cry, and He shall say, Here I am. If thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, and speaking vanity, and if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness be as the noonday. And there's a whole Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur angle we could take on this, but I'm not going to get into that today. And the Lord shall guide thee continually, and satisfy thy soul in drought, and make fat thy bones, and thou shalt be like a watered garden, and like a spring of waters, whose waters fail not. From the Proverbs, he that despiseth his neighbor sinneth, but he that has mercy on the poor, happy is he. He that has pitieth upon the poor lends to the Lord. That sounds to me like a no-lose situation, doesn't it? And that which he hath given, he will pay him again. Whoso stops his ears at the cry of the poor, he shall also cry himself, but shall not be heard. Gang, later on, as you look at the parable, you're going to see this one be fulfilled. He that giveth unto the poor shall not lack, but he that hideth his eyes shall have many a curse. In closing, from the sages. In Pirkei Avot 4:2, Ben Azai said, run to do a small mitzvah. As I get into this, what do you think mitzvah? You're saying, well, that's Hebrew for good deed. What's the concept of a good deed in Judaism? Even before it was called Judaism, because in the first century it wasn't called Judaism yet. That's a later term looking back. That is another name for commandment of the Torah, for precept of the Torah, for instruction of the Torah. These things which guide us and lead us, these things which teach us how to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our might, and all our soul, these instructions which teach us how to love our neighbor as ourselves. Right? This is run to do a small instruction and flee from sin, because the opposite of carrying out that instruction is not carrying that instruction, and that would be sin. That is the definition of sin. It says run to do a small mitzvah and flee from sin. For a mitzvah leads to mitzvah. In other words, if you're carrying out a commandment and you carry it out successfully, it leads to carrying out another commandment. Now, some people who aren't hearing for the glory of God, whose heart isn't in it for the glory of God, going, oh man, I just did a good deed. I just carried out an instruction. Here's another one. When does this end? There's a lot of thinking like that, and I pray to God you're not in it. But the idea is that you're carrying out this instruction to honor God, and what does He do? He brings forth another one where you might honor God, and maybe a bigger one, and then a bigger one, and then a bigger one. What does He do? He keeps giving you an opportunity to show your love towards Him in a greater capacity, on a more responsible manner, having something to give the Creator of the universe that created everything and needs nothing from you. Obedience is what you have to give. gives you something to give somebody who has everything. So when you're looking at presents and you're saying, boy, I don't know what to get Dad, I don't know what to give Mom, they've got everything. How much more so the Creator of the universe, who knows all your comings and goings, who has created all things. It gives you something to give Him, to say thank you, to say I love you. And it says that type of thinking, you would run to do a small mitzvah. You would flee from sin, knowing that mitzvah leads to mitzvah and sin leads to sin. One's a road that leads to the glory of the Lord. The other's a road that leads to the pit. It says, for the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, and the punishment of a sin is a sin. Gang, you wouldn't think that Lazarus, just laying there at the gate, he couldn't even get there on his own. What did he do? Do you know what he did? By needing help, by being destitute, by having nothing but a good name from the Lord, from needing of the world's compassion, of this rich man's compassion, of a small part of his surplus, he provided the opportunity for a mitzvah, didn't he? There was an opportunity provided by Lazarus' conditions from this rich man. He's feasting sumptuously every day. He could have thrown just the bread that they were wiping their hands off. He could have walked by and just thrown that to Lazarus. He wasn't asking for, a mansion of his own. He wasn't asking for his own purple and linen. He wasn't asking to be invited for the feast. He wasn't longing for any of that. Just give me the stuff you're cleaning your hands off with. That's a pretty small mitzvah, wouldn't you think? He's provided that opportunity to the rich man to glorify the Lord. And that wasn't taken. Remember, I'll read it one more time. Run to do a small mitzvah and flee from sin. For mitzvah leads to mitzvah. A small one leads to a larger one. But sin leads to sin. It's a progression. It's a snowball rolling downhill. For the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, and the punishment of a sin is a sin. Do you see a finality in this? Absolutely. Kingdom of heaven and the other place. Stay tuned. Shalom.